In this video, we are going to design a composite model for Berkshire Hathaway, and we're going to study the wealth of information based on this composite model. So let me open the database again, which was a sub-database of the AM Best Schedule P 2006. And let me go to a composite triangle group called BH, stands for Berkshire Hathaway. Let's open that. And this particular triangle group comprises other triangle groups, these ones here, which represent each one of the lines of business: private passenger automobile, medical malpractice occurrence, homeowners, farm owners, and so on. If we go to the Models tab and we look at the Composite Datasets tab, this is basically, let me move this down a bit. So the composite dataset.cds is each paid loss triangle from each one of the lines of business. It's not being aggregated, it's just sitting side by side. Now, in terms of models, let's suppose we have not designed any composite models yet. The starting point in designing a composite model are the models that were already designed in the Probabilistic Trend Family modeling framework, in the PTF modeling framework. And each one of these I call good. So what you do is you run these first in MPTF, in the multiple Probabilistic Trend Family module. We won't have to do more iterations because we're going to change the correlations. So this is the model display, and this model display is the kind of model display you would have had for each line of business in the PTF module. Okay? But now you've also computed the process correlation. So you go to the OC button, and you'll see that a lot of the correlations are in blue. The correlations in blue are insignificant. What we are going to do, we're going to treat all negative correlations as insignificant. Because if a negative correlation is in fact significant, you're going to afford a lot of credit you're going to afford a lot of diversification credit. We don't want to do that, so we'll leave that there. We're going to remove all the insignificant correlations to create clusters. What's a cluster? Within a cluster, any members belonging to the same cluster are significantly correlated. They have a significant process correlation. But between clusters, any two members who belong to a different cluster are not correlated. So you can see the system is set up, these clusters. For instance, cluster number 5 consists of these, or comprises these 3 lines of business. Let's see what's the highest process correlation. The highest process correlation is 0.5988. And you'll see later on that reserve distribution correlation is much lower than process correlation. So let's estimate this and close. So essentially our composite model is the volatility structure, which is made up of 2 parts, the trend structure and the process variability that has a normal distribution for each line of business, plus the correlations that we have between, incidentally, you notice that these correlations now are insignificant. So one thing I omitted to do is that we should have remove all insignificant correlations again. As we did more iterations before, some of the correlations became insignificant. Okay, so let's go back now and see what's the highest process correlations, 0.487. Let me tell you, all that wouldn't make much difference. I think you'll find that this model with this limited amount or number of significant process correlation is just about the same as having all process correlations being 0. In other words, all the lines are completely independent, no process correlation, and they don't share any common structure. We'll see that in a moment. Let's estimate that and close. And let's check again, we shouldn't have actually closed, to make sure that all correlations are in fact still significant. And that looks fine. Let's save this model as good, new. And just to show you that the structure, the trend structure for in-line of business is really the same, what we're going to, is not that it's the same as it was in PTF, but two lines of business do not share the same trend structure. So I'll go to the composite model and run good, new again. So we can do, so basically run the same model twice. And let's just compare now, for instance, on the right side, we've got BHO, that's homeowners, farm-owners. Let's look at the other side of PPA, and you can see it's got a very different trend structure, especially along the calendar years. CAL, so, I mean, obviously, both of them being CAL, they're the same. Let's go to CAL versus PPA. They're different. Workers' comp versus, say, PPA, very different. So they are in fact very different. And therefore, there are no common drivers. If you remember from the previous video, none of these lines of business actually share common drivers. So let me get rid of this particular run of the same model. We don't need both of them. And now that's forecast. And we're going to load inputs that we already created for the related or the independent PTF models. If I cancel this for a second and I go back to my database and I go to Berkshire Hathaway and I go to line of business, commercial auto liability, and I run its model, when I come to loading a forecast, can you see a forecast scenario going forward has already been set up? Okay, so I'm now going to close these regressions in the PTF module. I'm going to close this triangle group, and I'm going to navigate my way back into the composite model. And now I'm going to load the forecast scenarios, the related ones, for each line of business, which I've also called good. Let's use the Shift key here. Load. Now let's also forecast for the next underwriting year and create the combined table also of reserve plus next year's underwriting, so we can also compute the underwriting risk and compare it to the reserve risk. Let's now save this. Why don't we save it as good, new, combined? And I've done this before, where I've actually called the model good, and then the combined forecast scenario, good, combined. Anyway, so we're just repeating what I have done before on my own. And let's forecast now. We're going to create a lot of tables. This is actually the combined forecast table, aggregate first, so you can also see the next underwriting year. If you go to each line of business, the red is the standard deviation of a log normal, and the black is the mean of a log normal that we're projecting for that cell, because on a log scale, we do have log normal distributions. So we are projecting log normal distributions for every cell for each line of business. But they're also correlated, especially within clusters. So if there were only two lines of business, we're projecting log normals for every cell here that are correlated, log normals for every cell here. And if these two belong to the same cluster, there's also cross data set correlations between all the cells, but only within clusters. Okay, so we have that for every line. We also have a reserve forecast table. This is the reserve forecast table now, which doesn't include the next underwriting year. And let's look at it for the aggregate. And if you look at it for the aggregate, you'll notice something quite interesting, which is just based on a very fundamental principle of statistics. It's always easier to forecast the sum of many numbers than the sum of fewer numbers. And you'll see that the total fitted value through all the triangles, all the lines of business is 57.186 million, and the total observed value is 56.63. But if you look at a specific line of business, you won't see that closeness, especially if it has a lot of process variability. So if you've got a workers' comp, for instance, you'll see, okay, it's not too bad. It's 1.424, 1.346. What's OEA? I know is got a huge coefficient of variation, and let's see what that looks like. Well, you can see actually that's not too bad either. Okay, but you notice that the standard deviations, the coefficient of variations here are pretty large because OEA has a lot of process variability. In fact, the standard deviation of the normal distribution exceeds just over 0.6. Therefore, the coefficient of variation of the log normal distribution, just based on process variability, should be at least 60%. So 23 on 32 is at least 60%, and so on. We also have a forecast table for the next underwriting year for each line of business and for the aggregate, okay, based on those assumptions. When we forecast the next underwriting year, we didn't assume that there was any major shift in the accident year parameters. So for instance, for this line, the accident year level stays the same. We assume the same kind of accident year level for the next underwriting year with the same standard error. Although we can change this, we have the facility to change that assumption. So let's go to forecast summaries, and that has a lot of information in it. And let's go to the aggregate. And first of all, if you just focus on the blue tabs, we're looking at the accident year summary, and we have a mean reserve of around 24 billion. We have a standard deviation of 2 billion. The coefficient of variation is 9%. Let's not worry about these statistics here at the moment. Which is part of a different video. These are some new statistics that we create in version 10.4 that's going to be released in the second quarter of this year. The current system out is 10.3 that doesn't include these statistics. But if you look at the coefficient of variation for other lines of business, most of them will be larger than 9%. So we concentrate on the 9% coefficient of variation of the outstanding reserve. 24%, 4%, 18%, 51%. Now, all these we can actually see in a graph. So we go back to the aggregate, and we go to LOB comparisons, then you'll see that the coefficient of variation of the aggregate is 8.54%. The largest coefficient of variation is actually workers' comp. Okay, workers' comp is the largest coefficient of variation. That's 50.88%. The coefficient of variation of the aggregate, let's look at the aggregate, is 19.2. Sorry, we've got to do, how you get the aggregate here. It's 8.54%. Okay, that's the green line. So workers' comp has got the highest CV. Where is workers' comp here? This is the reserve mean by LOB's percentage of total reserve mean. Where's workers' comp? Where workers' comp has got the largest CV. It's 4.1% of the total business in terms of mean reserve. So it's not the smallest. I mean, you've got MMOCC, which has got it's a smaller proportion of the business, but also has a smaller CV. I mean, everything else being the same, the larger the volume, typically the lower the CV, the less the volatility. But that's everything else being the same. And over here, everything else is not the same. So you can have lines of business that represent a larger proportion of their business, and yet their CV might not be the lowest. But you also notice that the CV of the aggregate is less than the CV of most lines of business. I mean, there are some lines of business that have a lower CV, but the CV of the aggregate is less than most of them. Okay, which is well, that's just a statistical principle, which is based on the fact that the standard deviation of a sum is typically less or equal to the sum of the standard deviations. Okay, so by writing more risk, provided there wasn't too much correlation between them, you are in fact reducing the coefficient of variation. In fact, why don't we now look at the correlations in the reserve distributions. And between workers' comp and CMP, it's 0.19. But what's the actual process correlation? The actual process correlation is 0.357. So you see the reserve distribution correlation is in fact less. All right, what other statistics do we want to look at? Okay, so let's look now at risk capital allocation. So risk capital allocation, it depends on a covariance formula, and let's look at a graph of risk capital allocation. So most of the risk capital allocation depends on a variance covariance formula. So if you go to help and you go to the manual, how do I get the, okay, there's something here on risk capital. We use a variance covariance formula. See if I can find it. If you just bear with me. When we go there. So here's the formula. There it is. S squared is the variance of the sum of all the lines. So the proportion of risk capital you assign to a particular line, why don't we make this a bit bigger? The proportion of risk capital you assign to a particular line is its variance plus the sum of its covariances with the other lines of business divided by the variance of the total. Now, if the lines of business are completely independent, reserve distribution correlations are zero, then it's just the variance of that line divided by the sum of the variances, which is the same as the variance of the sum. So that's the covariance formula we actually use to assign risk capital to each line of business. Workers' comp gets 6%, and so on. Okay. Workers' comp, I think, had the largest coefficient of variation, but in terms of volume of business, out of the 23 for risk capital allocation, workers' comp, that's by accident years. What do I want to do? I want to go to what volume of business? So we've got to go to summary, and we've got to go to accident years. It's, well, you know, workers' comp in terms of reserve is only 971 million, but you can see it's got a huge coefficient of variation. So in terms of the aggregate reserve being around 24 billion, you can see that workers' comp is really a very small portion. Now, if you look at we've looked at risk capital allocation. If you now look at the payment stream by calendar year, so if we look at HOFO, for instance, let's turn to calendar years. For the aggregate, first of all, that's the payment stream by calendar year. And what does it really depend on? It depends on really what are the features in the incremental paid losses. So if we look at a line of business like workers' comp, say, and look at the trend structure for workers' comp, you can see with workers' comp, a lot of the money, everything else being the same, you pay in the next couple of calendar years. So because it starts decaying at development year 1. That's everything else being the same. So the payment pattern along the calendar years also depends on the development year trends. If it peaks at development year 7, for instance, if you have a line of business where it peaks in 7, and there are such lines, then you're still going to pay a lot of money in the next 7 calendar years, everything else being the same. And another feature of the data that determines how much you're going to pay in the payment stream along the calendar years is the future IOTA, the future inflation. And the larger it is, the more you're going to pay out later. So these two characteristics of the business, two risk characteristics, determine the payment stream along the calendar year. So by aggregate, for instance, you've already made, sort of 52% of your payments by 2008. That's on the aggregate, okay, for Berkshire Hathaway. So really, half of its reserves are just being allocated to the next 2 calendar years. But if you look at a specific line like workers' comp, you can see that it is very different. It's going to take to 2011 before you sort of pay half of your reserves. If you look at CMP, its half is by 2009, and so on. Again, it depends on the trend structure along the development years and what assumptions you're making about calendar year trends in the future. Now, we didn't actually use the default models. We used the models to forecast our reserves, but we also wanted to ensure that, in fact, the reserve estimates mean we obtain are the same as that held by the company. And that was kind of pretty easy to do. Let me show you how we did it. So that's your forecast summary. That's a combined forecast table. I don't need that. Reserve forecast table, future accident forecast table. So for instance, if I go to the HOFO, okay, and I look at forecast settings, well, for HOFO, the trend, calendar year trend is 0. But when we conducted our forecast, we assumed that the future calendar year trend is actually minus 56%. And that's an indication that the company for that line of business is under-reserved, because it's never had a trend of minus 56%. That's the only way we would get the mean, which is in Schedule P. If we look at another line of business, say workers' comp, you've got a 19.96% trend, but going forward we had to assume 30. So based on the Schedule P data, if there's any evidence, there's evidence of over-reserving and also probably misplaced capital. If you look at, for instance, another line, let's go to medical malpractice occurrence, 12% versus 0, so some evidence of over-reserving. Claims made, it's 0 more medical malpractice, 0 more recently, and again we had to assume a future trend of 50%. So considerable evidence of over-reserving. Okay. So what we're going to do now, we're actually going to now find the distribution of the aggregate reserves. We've done a forecast for the reserve. We've got a forecast summary for the reserves. We have a forecast summary for the next accident year. We also have risk capital allocation graphs and so on. Well, it's only for the next year. That's the actual particular year. Summary by data sets. Most of it is OEA. You can see OEA takes the lion's share of the risk capital allocation. Okay, we also have, have I shown you these? Yes, I have. If we go back to the forecast summary, if we go to LOB comparisons, I don't think I've shown you. I have shown you this graph, which is the CV of reserve distribution by LOB. These are the reserve mean by LOB. Yes, we have seen that. But you get the same displays when you look at the next accident year, and you also get for the combined. Okay, all these displays. So what I'm going to do now is just do the distribution of reserves for the time being. So we need to simulate. We're going to simulate essentially 10,000 times. Let me cancel this. Let's go with the forecast summary. We're going to simulate 10,000 times from all of these cells for each triangle. So let's do that to find the distribution of the aggregate reserves across all the lines of business. Let's do that. So we're simulating from all these log normals. As mentioned earlier in other videos, there's no analytical distribution for the sum of log normals. So to find the distribution of the sum of log normals that are correlated, we're going to do 10,000 simulations from each triangle. But by and large, because, I don't know, there's about 15 triangles and each one is forecast the development year 15, we're probably doing around somewhere with probably 10 million simulations from correlated log normals. And we'll create somewhere between, I don't know, 50 to 150 tables and or displays. So these are the simulated values by accident year for the aggregate. These are the simulated values by calendar year for the aggregate. We can look at the reserve distribution. I think the only good fit is the kernel fit. That's the reserve distribution. That's a distribution of the 10,000 values we simulated from the aggregate. We can do 100,000 also. There's jagged line. We can calculate quantiles, value at risk. For instance, the mean reserve is, we must have done this for the combined. Let me just check which simulation we did. We actually did a simulation for the combined. It doesn't matter, still illustrates the same ideas. That's also the next underwriting year. If you look at the table for the next underwriting year, it includes the combined table or combined summary. If you go to the aggregate, we're looking at 40.8 billion. So now this is your value at risk table. We've calculated VARs. We've also calculated T-VARs. T-VAR is larger than VAR. The VAR is based on a percentile, so the 95th percentile, if the VAR is 7.852 billion at 95%, we're saying there's a probability of 5% that if you reserve the mean of 40.817 billion, you lose at least 7.852 billion. The T-VAR also tells you how much would you lose if it does exceed the percentile of 48.669 billion. If it does exceed it, how much are you going to pay on the average? Well, you've got to add about another 3.5 billion. That's what you got to do. Okay, so the T-VAR also includes on top of the VAR how much would you lose on the average if in fact you exceed that percentile. We have a risk capital graphs. Let's look at those. This is a risk capital. This is at a VAR of 99%. That's the risk capital by LOB when total risk capital is 99%. So for instance, for REA, the risk capital is 11.4 billion. If you look at this here, the total mean is 14.8 billion. The total risk capital allocated to all the lines of business for the combined reserve and underwriting risk at 13.732 billion, and 11.4 billion of that actually is allocated to the line of business called REA. We have some other tables. This is the risk capital as a percentage of mean by LOB at the 99th percentile. It's 126%. 126% actually goes to REA. And this is percentages of the risk capital So you add up the risk capital. So let's suppose you provide both the risk capital plus the mean. So what is the risk capital as a percentage of the total? Risk capital plus mean. For REA, you can see it's 55.74% for, and the mean is 44.26% of the aggregate of those two, the risk capital and the mean. And this is what it is for the aggregate. So for the aggregate, it's 25% versus 74.83%. We're going to study more of this in the next video, what kind of diversification you get vis-a-vis. So for instance, if you only wrote REA, and what if you wrote REA and these other lines of business? You know, how much capital do you need if you only wrote REA, and how much capital do you need if you wrote REA and the other lines of business? And that will be the subject of the next video. What I'd like to do here is look at workers' comp perhaps. Where's workers' comp? Workers' comp, it's quite interesting. It's 307,000 is the risk capital allocation, the 99%, 307 million, and the mean is 1.385. And I think workers' comp had the largest percentage risk capital allocation. Is that correct? No, workers' comp had the largest CV. REA has the largest risk capital allocation, but workers' comp had the largest CV. So it's interesting. Workers' comp had the largest CV. Its capital allocation percentage. So workers' comp. So if you look at the risk capital plus the mean, the risk capital component is 18.16%, and workers' comp has got the largest CV, whereas REA has the largest capital allocation. It has risk capital of 55.74% and a mean of 44.26% of the aggregate of the mean and the the mean and the risk capital. Okay, I hope that's clear. What I'm going to do is actually run the model again. So I'm going to run good new again. So I've got it, and I'm going to run it again. So I've got 3 versions of good new. Then I'm going to do the forecast for each. I've got a load. So load good new combined for each one. Okay. That one was fast because we've done before. So it's the same model just being run 3 times. So we've got 2 copies of it. The original and 2 copies. But what we're going to do now is actually, for the first one, we'll do the reserve distribution. Well, we'll only do 1,000 simulations just to speed the matters up, in case you're getting tired. Reserve. And I want to show here something that is extremely important. Future, the next underwriting year. And combined. Now, most regulators and rating agencies calculate the reserve risk, then they calculate the underwriting risk, and they add the 2 together. And that's not correct, because by writing more business in the next accident year, you actually afford more risk credit diversification, because what you write in the next underwriting year is not just new business, it's actually the renewal of a lot of the old business that shares similar characteristics to the old business. So this is a combined. Let's look at the combined. This is combined. This one is going to be the future underwriting year. Excuse me. Let me just hold them again. Let's look at it 95%. Okay. At 95% on the left, it might be hard for you to read. Let's make it big. 95% on the left. What is this? This is the next underwriting year. Your total risk capital is 5.78 billion for the next underwriting year. The risk capital you need for your reserve is 6.4 billion. I used to be able to see these. Sorry, let's go to 95 on each. Made a mistake here. I thought I could see these, the risk capital. Is it somewhere else what the risk capital, we can see what the risk capital is? Yeah, total risk capital, that's much easier to read. Total risk capital, easier to read. Total risk capital, easier to read. Okay, now, for the combined, the risk capital, this is for combined underwriting and reserve, the risk capital is 7.8 billion. For your future accident year, it's 5.7 billion. For your reserve, it's 3.78. And you'll see that the sum of the risk capital for reserve and future underwriting year exceeds the combined risk charge. And again, let me try and explain that. It's always easier to forecast the sum of many numbers than the sum of fewer numbers. So that if you're also projecting the following part of the triangle, come on. If you're also doing your projections for this part of the triangle, you're not just forecasting the numbers in these cells, but you're also forecasting more numbers. More numbers. So you might actually find that the CV, the coefficient of variation of the combined reserve plus underwriting is not necessarily larger than either the CV of the reserve or the CV of the underwriting. Okay? You don't actually necessarily increase the CV. You are forecasting more numbers. And as a result of that, you get some risk diversification credit. So typically what you'll find, these risk charges are not additive. The risk charge for the combined risk is typically less than the sum of the risk charge for the reserve and the risk charge for the underwriting. Thank you.